Hey guys, and welcome back to Monka, where stupid shit ensues, and the stupid shit that was gonna ensue was I was gonna try to do my intro in Chinese for, the theme of what we're gonna be talking about, but fuck that, because that is insanely difficult, and I don't even know where I begin to start. It would take so long to learn my intro in Chinese, so we're gonna skip that. But yesterday I beat a game, so I kinda wanna talk about it. But yesterday I beat Mato Anomalies, specifically the version that launched on the Nintendo Switch. Mato Anomalies came out in March of 2023 for obviously the Nintendo Switch, as well as the Xbox, PlayStation, and PC via Steam. The game is a turn-based RPG based in Neo, China. It is published by Prime Matter and developed by Arrowwiz. Now, Arrowwiz is kind of interesting because, to be honest, when I looked into their history, this is like their first major game that they've ever made. Before this, they made 2 VR games, and that's all they had in their pedigree, so this is pretty much the biggest game that they've ever made, which is kind of interesting nonetheless. But I mentioned that it was an RPG and not a JRPG, because some people have been calling this a JRPG, but it's kind of a misnomer. This is JRPG inspired, but it's not a JRPG because the developers are Chinese. So technically, really, it's just an RPG, but it is JRPG inspired, and we'll get into that when we get into that. But the long and the short of my opinion on Mato Anomalies is that it took me 53 hours to beat, and this game overstays its welcome by about 18 of those hours. I think this should have been a lot shorter of a game. It has a lot of filler, to be honest, and it kind of hurts the experience in a lot of ways having all of that filler. If it had cut back on the filler, I think this would have been a lot better of a streamlined game and been a lot more fun, but unfortunately that filler kind of hurts this game in a lot of ways. But it's overall a decent game, but honestly I can't really recommend it. But in terms of the graphics and performance, the graphics on the Switch are fine. They look decent and they're nothing offensive on the Switch. Now this is kind of a game that I wish I kept my blinders on for and didn't really look into before buying it, because when I saw the graphics initially, they looked really beautiful, and I imagine that was on the next gen systems. On the Switch it definitely does not look as beautiful as it does on other systems. However, it looks fine all around. In terms of the performance is kind of wishy-washy, to be honest. It runs pretty stable for the most part, but there's a lot of points where the game will stutter and skip, and sometimes will have frame drops. They did an update not too long ago, and I don't really think it changed anything performance-wise, but for the most part, the game does run decent. There were points though where I was experiencing stutters and frame drops though, but in terms of the graphics, they're fine for the Nintendo Switch. I just kind of got bummed out because I looked at preview shots too much, and when I actually got my hands on the game, I was like, oh, this doesn't look as good as I saw, but I saw these screenshots for the next generation game. On the Switch though, it looks fine. At the performance, it performs fine for the most part, but just know that there is stuttering and occasionally frame drops, and on 2 occasions I did have the game crash on me. But in terms of music and voice acting, the music is alright, to be honest. It has a hard time really staying fresh over the 53 hours of the game, but it's an alright soundtrack, to be honest. It's very ambient for the most part. I do like the kind of Chinese inspired inflections inside of the soundtrack as well. There are points when you can kind of tell that there's some Chinese influence in the soundtrack, and I like that part because it really fits the theme and the kind of culture that the developers have. But otherwise, the soundtrack is pretty decent. I do kind of like the synth heavy sound that it has for the most part, and the kind of atmospheric ambient soundtrack that it has is pretty neat, to be honest, but it didn't really blow me away, honestly. Like I said, it's a decent soundtrack, but it's nothing crazy, but I do like the Chinese influence within the soundtrack. Now, in terms of the voice actors, I played this game in Chinese. There are 3 options for voice acting. You can either choose between English, Japanese, or Chinese. Since the developers were Chinese, I decided to kind of, roll with what was and just go with Chinese voice acting. And to be honest, it was decent. And I imagine all 3 variations of the voice acting are decent. The voice actors, even though I don't speak or understand Chinese, I can tell that there was kind of no real emotion inflicted in the lines that they were delivering. At some points, maybe there was, but for the most part, it just wasn't really there. Now, I'll grab about the voice acting, and we'll get to this kind of when we also get to the gameplay, but the gameplay has a heavy visual novel aspect to it, but there is no voice acting during the visual novel scenes. It is all reading. There's only voice acting during battles and cutscenes, but otherwise the visual novel parts do not have any voice acting at all. And it should be noted that the visual novel aspect of this game is very heavy, so that means instead of having those visual novel scenes voice acted, it's just a whole bunch of reading. I get that it's because the game is on a budget, but it really hurts those visual novel parts because they're just not voice acted, and they really should have been, because it would have added more quality to the game instead of just reading line after line after line with an absolute silence with just the music playing in the background. But in terms of music, it's decent, but nothing crazy, to be honest. But I do like the Chinese influence within the music. It makes the game unique. And as well, the voice acting is decent, but I just wish that the visual novel parts were voice acted as well. But in terms of the story is based in a futuristic China, specifically a city called Mato, which is a fictional city that does not exist in China, but it has a kind of futuristic futuristic sci-fi, cyberpunk, however you want to put it, setting based in China. Now the main character name is Do, who is a private investigator who was hired by an informant named Nightshade to investigate something called Handout. Now nobody really knows what Handout is, and that's why she hired Do to investigate Handout. Now upon investigating it, Do gets sucked into something called a layer, which is infested with creatures and is like another dimension. He's saved by a mysterious character called Graham, who kind of swings in and intervenes and saves him from the monsters within the realm, which in this game they call the Bane Tide. Now at this point, Do and Graham link up, and Do does the investigating on the outside while Graham does the fighting of the monsters inside the layers, and they pretty much try to find the source of Handout while also trying to figure out why layers exist and the overarching narrative to why this is all happening and pretty much why the world is having these anomalies. Along the way as well though, Do and Graham are joined by more characters who join up in the party. That is really oversimplifying the story because I really don't want to spoil it, because to be honest it's actually a pretty decent story, but that's kind of what you get in the prologue and as well kind of what chapter 1 digs into as well. But the game spans 10 chapters for its story, and to be honest the prologue and chapter 1 are really good, to be honest, and this game has a really strong opening. Now chapter 2 through chapter 7 really drags, and that's where a lot of the filler comes in. There could have been some cut chapters in this game, to be honest, but this game has so much filler within the story that's not even funny. It really drip feeds you like the points of the story throughout those 7 in between chapters, and honestly it's kind of a painful drag, to be honest, because it just feeds you that story so slowly and like the points are so slowly developed that I wish that it just had more speed to it, because at points it feels like the story isn't even progressing at all. It just feels like you're kind of staying static, and to be honest in this game that's why it's so hard to judge where you are in relation to where the story is, because really I had no idea where I was in relation to the game coming to an end until I was at the end of the game and the game ended, and I was like, oh shit, the game's actually ending, because it feels like at so many points the game should have ended and it just keeps going. So the story has a lot of filler and they really should have cut a lot of that out. But the beginning, which is the prologue and chapter 1, are a really strong opener to the game, and then chapters 7, 8, and 9 are a really strong closing to the game. Chapters 2 through 6 just have a shit ton of filler, and to be honest they should have cut a lot of that out. But I thought the story was decent, but like I said, there's just way too much filler in this story, to be honest. But in terms of the characters are pretty decent as well. Your main two characters are going to be Do and Graham, and as well, like I said, there are several other characters that join you throughout your story, and as well there's some side characters as well. The main party characters are decent, but like I said, the visual novel parts not being voice acted kind of hurt this as well, because it kind of holds it back from the characters having a lot of personality. You kind of just have to give them a certain type of personality since they're not voice acted. But the characters are decent enough, but they're not anything that I go crazy over, to be honest. But in terms of the story and characters, the story is decent, but it has way too much filler, and really in the next game, if they make another game, they really need to cut a lot of filler out. And the characters are decent, but they're nothing that I'd go crazy over, to be honest. Now in terms of the gameplay, this is the meat and potatoes of Mato Anomalies, of course. They do put a heavy focus on the story, but as well there's a pretty heavy focus on the gameplay element. Now the gameplay element is divided up into several sections that we'll kind of talk about. There's the exploring of Mato as Do, and then there's the dungeon crawling part, which we'll be doing with Graham and the party members, and as well there's the visual novel aspect. Now between the gameplay and the visual novel, I'm not sure what the split is, but I imagine it's probably a 60-40 in favor of gameplay. However, that being said, this game has a very heavy focus on visual novel aspects, and really where that comes to hurt the game is the fact that, like I said, it's not voice acted. Now that being said, the sprites for the visual novel scenes are actually really well animated, and they're actually pretty beautiful, to be honest. The sprites for the visual novel parts just have a lot of detail to them, and they have a really cool art style to them that makes them stand out. But I think the really cool elements to it that just showed that they put a lot of detail on was the fact that I remember playing the game and one character got nervous at one point, and they had the shocked expression on their face in their sprite, but as well they had sweat running down their face. That's a really cool attention to detail that I can really appreciate within the visual novel aspect. But I thought the visual novel aspect was cool. It's just a lot of reading, to be honest, and really you don't get any choices throughout it, but really it's hurt by the fact that there's just no voice acting in it. Now that being said, the visual novel aspects are pretty short enough to where they're broken up enough to where it just doesn't drag on for too long. But another element of the game, like I said, is the exploring of Mato China as Do. Now Do being the investigator, we'll be doing the walking around Mato and exploring that area. Now Mato, to be honest, isn't really all that interesting of a city to explore, to be honest, and it's kind of small. There just really isn't a whole lot of exploration to be done as Do and Mato, and to be honest, that kind of hurts the game. And that kind of small scope as well hurts the game, because it really does not feel like an adventure, to be honest. The game only really has good momentum at the beginning when you're just learning Mato, and at the end when you're actually kind of doing something besides, you know, running around Mato and going going into dungeons. But Mato is really interesting to explore when you start the game, at least, because there's a lot of detail. However, there's a lot of empty space in the world as well where they just don't do anything. It's just kind of like filler areas that they have to make the world feel bigger than it really is. But these areas are just big with nothing really to do in them. But it's a cool setting nonetheless, but the areas get bland pretty quick because you're really just not going anywhere. You're just exploring this big open area, going from point to point, but not really doing all that much. But within the exploration of Mato, you can speak to characters, get side quests, which there's a lot of side quests in this game. You can also speak to companions to get some of their side stories, and as well within the exploring of Mato China, usually within main story plots and within side quests, there's actually a card game based aspect to this game, which is kind of surprising. Now, it isn't all that good, to be honest, and honestly I kind of wish it wasn't even really in the game because it just kind of unnecessary. I feel like it was just experimentation by the devs to see kind of what would work, but it's fine, to be honest, but it's pretty shallow and it's uninteresting. It kind of plays like any other card game where you have action points for the move, both characters have life points, and they also have attack and defense and all of that stuff. It's a pretty basic card game, to be honest. It's cool that they, I guess, experiment with it, but honestly the game really didn't need it. And it's pretty shallow because you only have 6 decks to pick from, and as well you can't really customize your cards or anything. So while I think the aspect is cool, I think it's totally unnecessary, and if they do make a sequel to this game, I think they can remove it. But all that being said, the main meat and potatoes of this game is the dungeon crawling. Now, the dungeon crawling, and really this game in general, I've seen heavily compared to Persona, which I disagree with because this game really isn't like Persona at all. Its closer comparison, honestly, is to Shin Megami Tensei. I feel like if I saw that comparison more, I would agree with it because this game is very heavily inspired by Shin Megami Tensei. That's within the difficulty as well. This game is actually pretty fucking difficult. And if you know me and Shin Megami Tensei, I really didn't like the game for its difficulty. I was able to get to this game, but goddamn, it was a hard game. But the dungeon crawling is kind of boring, to be honest. The dungeons are very uninspired, in my opinion, and they don't give you a lot to look at. You pretty much follow very linear paths to whatever objective you're going to within the dungeon, so there isn't all that much in the way of exploration, and that's kind of underwhelming, to be honest. But as well, within the dungeons, the enemies are in fixed locations. There are no random encounters. You just have enemies in the map that are like very much in fixed positions. It's kind of weird because, like I said, they are fixed and they don't wander or anything. They're just kind of static, which is kind of weird, to be honest. But like I said, it's the first attempt in an RPG, so I can't blame it that much. But just know that the encounter system is kind of weird as well. But the dungeons, being uninspired as they are, kind of leads to the battle system. Now, the battles are kind of a generic JRPG, in my opinion. They don't do anything too crazy, and like I said, it's a turn-based game. Very reminiscent, like I said, of something like Shin Megami Tensei. Now, this game actually has a good amount of strategy to it, and that's something that I can very much appreciate about this game. The turn-based battles actually have a decent amount of strategy to them, and I actually found myself at a lot of points having to use buffs, debuffs, and all that shit just to kind of get through battles, because it actually is kind of a really strategic turn-based game, and I haven't played a really like strategic and deep turn-based battle game in a long time, and I can really appreciate it in this game. That being said, it really just is kind of a generic turn-based game. There is no SP system. All of your moves are based on a cooldown based system, but mainly what I can appreciate about the battle system is that it's very much strategic. You really will have to plan your moves out and really actually have to take a strategic approach to turn-based battles instead of spamming moves and knock your enemies out, mainly because of the leveling system, which we'll get to in a second. But I can really appreciate the kind of strategic approach that they take to turn-based battles. Instead of it just being mashing the attack button and killing your enemies, you actually have to use debuffs and buffs and use DOT and shit like that, and element-based attacks to really just plan out your battles to survive the battles, because they're difficult and they take a lot of strategy to win, which I can appreciate. This is by far the strongest part of this game, and I hope they carry it over to a sequel if they make one. But other than that, the only thing really to talk about is the level up system and as well the gear system. Now, the level up system in this game, you level up really slow. I think I hit level 48 before I beat the game, but in this game you level up really slow, and so at no point in the game, which can kind of be considered a fault, but at no point during the game do you feel powerful, like that you're ever more powerful than your enemies. Pretty much throughout the entire game, you feel like you're par on par with your enemies that you're fighting. This game always feels like an even match. It never feels like you're any better or worse than your enemies at any point. It always feels like you're evenly matched with them when you're in fights, which is kind of cool. But to be honest as well, you kind of miss that power trip that you usually have in JRPGs where you get overpowered and you're just smashing your enemies. But just know that you do level up slow. You can kind of grind to get through that, but even with grinding, you won't get get all that much more powerful than your enemies. But as well in terms of the gear and as well in terms of your talent system, gears are kind of a weird system that they implement to the game to try and make it more unique. But the way I think about it is almost like the tank attachment system from Valkyria Chronicles 4, or as well from Mega Man Battle Network 3. They kind of had this weird Tetris system where you could place parts in to try and optimize Mega Man, but gears are pretty much buffs that you can add to your teammates, so things like more HP or more attack. But as well, the pieces have slots to where if you link up certain matching pieces together, you can get buffs as well on top of the other buffs. But this system is cool, but it's kind of a gimmick that they add into the game. But as well, the only thing you get in terms of weapon upgrades are just that. You only get weapon upgrades. You do not have armor that gets upgraded in this game. From chapter to chapter, you can just get better weapons. But as well, every time you level up in this game, you get talent points, which are just kind of like, you know, talent points from any other game. You can use these to add to character abilities to either increase your attack or gain new abilities, or as well buff your current weapons or stuff like that. Now, I actually kind of like the talent system in this game because it actually works to your advantage. You actually get a lot of worthwhile buffs in this game from using the talent system, and you can really customize your character to really fit the needs of your party and as well fit the needs of what you need them to be. So I actually like the talent system in this game. A lot of games have talent systems that kind of really don't do anything, but in this game you can really optimize it to make a character that really works to your party's strength or that works to your strength. But another thing to mention in terms of gameplay is the fact that it kind of takes a different approach to a party system. Your party all shares one health bar and as well one level bar, so you all share the same amount of health, which is kind of interesting. Your party pretty much has a merged health that it uses, which I kind of like, to be honest. It's kind of unique. But as well, the party shares an overall level, so all characters level evenly and gain the same amount of levels. So that means even if a character joins really late, they still have the same levels as everyone else in the party, and they as well get all the talent points that the other party members had previously. But that system, I kind of like it a lot because at no point can your party characters really fall behind. The only way they can really fall behind is having lower level weapons, but other than that, they'll always have the same level as every other party character, and as well, everyone shares HP, so there's no worry about them falling behind in that aspect as well. But I kind of like that. When I started the game, I didn't think I'd really like it, but I actually like that aspect of this game. But overall, in terms of the gameplay, it's pretty decent. I don't think the visual novel parts overstay their welcome. I think the exploration of Mato at first is interesting, but it becomes quickly bland, and I really like the strategy of the battle system, and I like some of the elements that they implement into that as well, like the merged HP and level ups. But overall, my opinions on Mato Anomalies is that I have a lot of mixed opinions on this game. I actually really like some aspects of this game, and I find it pretty enjoyable, to be honest, at points, because the battle system is very strategic, but the game is really held back by its length and kind of the fact that you don't get a lot of exploration in Mato and quickly becomes boring with all the empty areas it has in it. But if this game were shorter, I would say maybe 30 hours, I think I'd be able to recommend it, to be honest, because there's a decent story here and the gameplay is decently fun. Now, that being said, yes, I did do all the side quests and all of that, so that's probably why it took me 53 hours, but as well within that story, it just feels bloated at times, and it feels like it's just taking up too much space. It feels like there's a lot of filler within that story as well. But would I recommend this game? Honestly, and I kind of feel bad for being harsh about it, but I really don't feel like I can recommend this game. Now, with that being said, I did enjoy my time with this game. I feel like maybe at a discount of like $10, it would be worth picking up, but otherwise, I feel like with all that filler, it makes it hard to recommend this game. Now, that being said, I hope the developers make a sequel to this game and improve upon it, because what I did get from this game, I really did enjoy overall, but the flaws really hold it back from being a game that I could truly recommend. But thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I'll see you. Stay chill.